Welcome to this remarkable frontier chronicle, where forgotten wisdom and unexpected innovation collide with tradition in ways that would forever change the course of local history. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're listening from and the exact time of day or night you found this story. It's always fascinating to see how far these frontier tales travel and when they reach you. The weathered pages of the Blue Ridge County records from 1847 contain a peculiar entry that has puzzled historians for over a century. On November 12th of that year, local magistrate Jeremiah Holcomb documented a formal complaint filed by several prominent logging operators against one Abraham Kincaid, a relative newcomer to the Appalachian Highlands of Western Virginia. The complaint, written in the magistrate's meticulous copperplate hand, describes an excessive and unnecessarily complex arrangement of pulleys and hemp cordage constructed on Kincaid's remote timber, claim that supposedly allowed him to move mighty trunks that 4 oxen could not budge. The complaint itself would be unremarkable. Frontier settlements were often hotbeds of neighborly disputes and professional jealousies, except for an unusual addendum. 3 months later, in February 1848, every man who had signed the original complaint returned to the magistrate to formally withdraw their grievances. No explanation was provided, and the matter was summarily closed. The magistrate noted only that the men appeared humbled in demeanor and reluctant to elaborate on their change of heart. What transpired in those winter months of 1848 remained largely unexamined until 1963. When a collection of personal effects belonging to Abraham Kincaid's grandson was donated to the Virginia Historical Society. Among these effects was a leather-bound journal containing detailed sketches of an ingenious pulley system alongside daily accounts that shed light on one of the most remarkable yet unheralded innovations in American frontier engineering, and the harrowing circumstances that proved its worth. The story begins in the spring of 1845 when Abraham Kincaid, then 37 years old, arrived in the Blue Ridge region after an arduous journey from Vermont. According to county census records from 1840, Kincaid had previously operated a small shipbuilding enterprise in Burlington, where he had developed a reputation for innovative rigging designs. The economic downturn following the Panic of 1837 had forced many such specialized craftsmen to seek opportunities elsewhere, and the expanding frontier with its abundant natural resources beckoned to those with technical skills and limited capital. Unlike many who came seeking fertile valley land for farming, Kincaid was drawn to the densely forested slopes and ridgelines where massive oak, chestnut, and walnut trees stood untouched. According to county deed records, he purchased 180 acres of heavily wooded land at the confluence of Stony Creek and the North Fork, paying what locals considered an excessive sum for terrain too steep and rocky for conventional agriculture. The deed, still preserved in county archives, shows he paid $212.75 for the parcel, approximately 1.18 per acre, at a time when such marginal land typically sold for less than half that amount. Kincaid's timber claim lay approximately 7 miles from the settlement of Liberty, now Bedford, connected by a rough wagon trail that became nearly impassable during wet seasons. The property featured dramatic elevation changes, with nearly 800 feet of vertical rise from the creek bed to the highest ridge. These topographical challenges, which most settlers would view as obstacles, appear to have been precisely what attracted Kincaid to the location. His journal entry upon finalizing the purchase reveals his strategic thinking. Secured deed to timber stand today. Slope and aspect ideal for gravitational advantage. Northern exposure will minimize sunlight damage to felled timber. Creek sufficient for small-scale floating operations during spring freshet. Natural rock formations will serve as anchor points. Possibilities exceed expectations. From the outset, Kincaid's methods raised eyebrows among the established logging operators in the region. While others immediately set to clearing accessible timber with teams of oxen or horses to drag logs to the nearest stream for the spring float, Kincaid spent his first months meticulously surveying his property. His journal entries from that period reveal a methodical mind cataloging every contour of the land, every stand of timber, and, most unusually, detailed observations of wind patterns, seasonal water flow, and the composition of soil and rock formations. May 18, 1845 completed survey of North Ridge, oak and hickory predominant, some exceeding 4 feet in diameter. Ground falls away too steeply for conventional hauling. Stream below carries sufficient water only during spring thaw and after heavy rains. Noted 3 natural anchor points where bedrock surfaces. These will serve admirably. May 23, 1845, mapped central drainage. Evidence of occasional flash flooding. No suitable fording points for teams. Will require elevated transport solution. Western Ridge offers promising line of sight to creek bed with minimal obstruction. Possibility for direct transport without intermediate handling. Such entries continued throughout his first spring and early summer. While his neighbors were actively harvesting timber, Kincaid had yet to fell a single tree. This deviation from established practice did not go unnoticed in the close-knit community, where a man's worth was often judged by his visible productivity. The local tavern in Liberty became a forum for speculation about the strange northerner and his unusual approach to logging. According to an account recorded by Liberty's postmaster William Garnett in his personal memorandum book, much discussion at Miller's Tavern regarding the Yankee on Stony Creek. Sutton claims he has not seen a single log come down despite 3 months' residence. Brooks wagers he will be destitute by winter. Harper suggests he may be surveying for the railroad interests, using timber as a pretense. Much laughter at this notion given the terrain in question. Throughout that first summer, while other loggers were actively harvesting timber, Kincaid built a modest cabin and a surprisingly substantial workshop. The cabin itself was unremarkable, a simple 16 by 20-foot structure with a loft, typical of frontier dwellings. But the workshop, as described in Kincaid's journal and later confirmed by archaeological investigation conducted in 1968, was anything but standard. Measuring 24 by 36 feet, the workshop featured a foundation of carefully fitted stone, unusual in a region where most outbuildings were constructed on simple post foundations. It included a stone forge with bellows, an anvil mounted on a massive oak stump set into the earth, and, most remarkably, a water-driven trip hammer connected to a small diversion from Stony Creek. This level of industrial equipment was extraordinarily rare in such a remote location and represented a substantial investment of both capital and labor. Receipts from the mercantile in nearby Liberty show regular purchases of iron stock, tool steel, and unusually large quantities of hemp rope in various diameters. The proprietor's ledger notes that Kincaid special ordered several mechanical components from Richmond, brass bushings, iron pulleys, and other hardware that were rarities in the frontier setting. A notation from August 1845 indicates that Kincaid paid a premium of $12 for express delivery of precision-machined components from a foundry in Philadelphia, a significant expense at a time when a skilled laborer might earn $1 per day. The merchant's son, later interviewed for the county historical record in 1902, recalled, "Father said the Kincaid fellow was either a mechanical genius or a complete fool, ordering city-made parts when most men made do with local blacksmith work. He paid cash for everything, never asked for credit, and would spend hours examining the quality of rope, running it through his fingers inch by inch before purchasing." Most peculiar was his insistence on the precise diameter and lay of the rope, characteristics most men would never consider. Local accounts preserved in the County Historical Society describe the curiosity and sometimes derision that Kincaid's activities prompted. Ezra Sutton, a prominent logging operator whose teams harvested timber throughout the region, was quoted as saying, "That Yankee fellow spends more time with paper and pencil than with saw and axe. His hands are too soft for the work he claims to be about." Similar sentiments echoed throughout the small community where a man's worth was measured by the tangible results of his labor, not by the time spent in preparation. By the fall of 1845, While his neighbors were settling in for the winter with well-stocked woodpiles and root cellars, Kincaid had yet to bring a single marketable log to the sawmill. Instead, he had constructed what locals called his spider's web, an elaborate system of ropes, pulleys, and counterweights strung between strategic points on his property. He had driven iron spikes deep into several massive trees and anchored thick cables to exposed bedrock outcroppings. In his workshop, he had fabricated specialized pulleys with multiple wheels of different diameters mounted on the same axle, a design that puzzled those who caught glimpses of his work. Kincaid's system, as detailed in his journal and technical drawings, was in fact a sophisticated application of mechanical principles that were well established in maritime settings but rarely applied to land-based operations. At its core was the concept of the block and tackle, a system of pulleys and ropes that creates mechanical advantage, allowing a relatively small force to move a much larger load. But Kincaid had elaborated on this basic principle in several innovative ways. First, he had created what he termed compound pulley blocks, devices that combined multiple pulleys of different diameters on a single axle. This arrangement allowed for differential movement rates within a single system, a principle similar to that used in modern differential gears. By carefully calculating the ratios between pulley diameters, he could create systems where a slight movement at one point would translate to a larger or smaller movement elsewhere, depending on the specific task required. Second, he had incorporated counterweights into his systems, using stones, logs, or in some cases, water-filled barrels that could be emptied or filled to adjust their mass. These counterweights served both to balance loads and to store potential energy that could be released when needed, effectively creating a rudimentary form of mechanical battery. Third, he had developed specialized terminal connections for his ropes that minimized wear and prevented unraveling. His journal describes a technique of whipping and splicing that involved intricate patterns of interwoven fibers sealed with a mixture of beeswax and pine tar. These connections, according to his notes, retained over 90% of the rope's original strength, compared to the 60 to 70% typical of standard knots. Perhaps most impressively, Kincaid had designed his entire system to take maximum advantage of the terrain. By positioning his main anchor points at specific locations determined through his careful surveying, he created what he called natural mechanical advantages, leveraging gravity, the structural strength of particular trees, and the contours of the land itself to enhance the efficiency of his rope systems. The winter of 1845-46 passed without incident. When spring arrived, Kincaid finally began to fell timber, but his approach remained unorthodox. Rather than clearing entire sections of forest as was common practice, he selectively harvested the largest specimens, often situated in the most inaccessible ravines and slopes. Neighbors observed him working alone, using his rope systems to control the direction of a falling tree with uncanny precision, then employing his pulley arrangements to move logs that would typically require a team of oxen and several men. Thomas Whitley, a teamster who transported lumber from the sawmill to markets downriver, recorded in his account book, witnessed Kincaid's contraption today. The man uses no animal but himself, yet moved an oak trunk of at least 30 inches diameter up a slope that would challenge my best team. Uses a system of blocks and tackles arranged in a manner I have not seen before. He calls it mechanical advantage, but seems more like mechanical oddity to my eye. The significance of Kincaid's approach extended beyond mere technical innovation. In the traditional logging operations of the time, a substantial portion of the potential profit was consumed by the costs of maintaining draft animals and hiring teamsters. A typical logging crew might include a faller who actually cut the trees, several swampers who cleared brush and prepared skid roads, and teamsters with their oxen or horses who dragged the logs to collection points or directly to mills. Each man had to be paid, each animal had to be fed and cared for, and the entire operation could be halted by injury to man or beast. Kincaid, working primarily alone with his mechanical systems, eliminated most of these costs and vulnerabilities. His journal entries from this period include detailed calculations comparing his approach to conventional methods. June 12, 1846. Extracted walnut from ravine, today. 32 inches at base, approximately 2,200 pounds. Conventional approach would require 2 oxen, teamster, 2 laborers, at minimum cost of $3.75 plus feed for animals. My system required 4 hours of personal labor, negligible rope wear. Value of timber at mill estimated at 18 févanois. Clear advantage to mechanical approach, not accounting for superior condition of log delivered without drag damage. Such calculations appear throughout his records, consistently demonstrating the economic advantage of his methods, particularly for high-value timber that commanded premium prices only if delivered in pristine condition. Logs dragged by animal teams often suffered damage, splits, gouges, and abrasions that reduced their value. Kincaid's system, by suspending logs above the ground using his rope networks, preserved their quality and thus their market value. Despite the successful delivery of such valuable timber without the expense of draft animals or hired hands, Kincaid's methods failed to impress his neighbors. Instead, his success seemed to deepen their skepticism. The frontier valued straightforward approaches. A strong back, a sharp axe, and perhaps a good team of oxen were all a man should need. Kincaid's system of mechanical advantage, with its complex arrangement of ropes, pulleys, and counterweights, struck many as unnecessarily elaborate, perhaps even suspicious. In the words of one local deacon, preserved in church minutes, "There is something unnatural about a man who seeks to avoid honest sweat through contrivances." Throughout 1846 and into 1847, Kincaid continued his methodical harvesting, gradually refining his system. His journal entries show a preoccupation with increasing the efficiency of his pulley arrangements and reducing friction in the system. He developed a specialized lubricant of tallow, graphite, and linseed oil that he applied to his rope systems and pulley bearings. He experimented with different braiding patterns for his ropes, noting which configurations offered the best strength-to-weight ratio and resistance to wear. A particularly significant innovation from this period was his development of what he termed self-lubricating bushings for his pulleys. According to his technical drawings, these consisted of a hardwood outer sleeve, typically dogwood or persimmon, both noted for their wear resistance, with a core of softer wood, usually basswood, that had been impregnated with his lubricant mixture. As the pulley turned, the softer wood would gradually release small amounts of lubricant, maintaining the system without requiring frequent manual application. An entry from September 1847 reads, "Completed new compound pulley block with 4.1 advantage. When combined with the existing system, should provide 16.1 mechanical advantage, sufficient to move the large walnut on the north ridge that I estimate at 4,800 pounds. Weather turning. Must prepare for early winter." That last line, "must prepare for early winter," reveals Kincaid's attention to environmental patterns that many of his neighbors overlooked. Throughout his journal, he meticulously recorded weather observations. Barometric pressure, measured with an instrument he had brought from Vermont, cloud formations, wind patterns, and their correlation with subsequent weather conditions. These observations were not merely academic, they informed his operational planning and, more importantly, his preparations for seasonal challenges. By the fall of 1847, these observations had led him to anticipate a particularly severe winter, a prediction that most locals dismissed as the overcautious nature of a New Englander unaccustomed to the milder Virginia climate. Kincaid noted unusually early migrations of certain bird species, changes in the behavior of local wildlife, and, most significantly, patterns in the formation and dissipation of morning fog that, according to his journal, correlate strongly with exceptional winter severity in my 20 years of observation. In response to his own forecast, Kincaid undertook preparations that seemed excessive to his neighbors. He reinforced his cabin with additional chinking and a second layer of split shakes on the roof. He constructed a sheltered walkway connecting his cabin to his workshop and woodshed, using saplings and canvas to create a tunnel-like structure. Most notably, he stockpiled firewood in quantities that became a subject of local humor, enough, by one account, to keep a small village warm through 2 winters. His journal details these preparations with characteristic thoroughness. October 4, 1847. Completed additional roof layer. Used split oak shakes soaked in linseed oil for water resistance. Overlapped pattern should shed snow more effectively than standard arrangement. Will test with first significant accumulation. October 10, 1847. Added second layer of chinking to north and west walls. Mixture of clay, straw, and lime should provide superior insulation compared to standard mud. Particular attention to area around chimney base, where draft was noted last winter. October 15, 1847. Constructed covered walkway between structures. Framework of bent saplings covered with canvas, treated with same mixture used for rope weatherproofing. Should withstand snow load of up to 18 inches, according to calculations. More importantly, will allow movement between buildings without exposure to wind and precipitation. He also made modifications to his rope system, adding additional anchoring points and constructing covered storage boxes at key junctures to protect components from ice and snow. In his journal, he noted, hemp rope loses 40% of its strength when saturated with ice. Have treated all lines with mixture of beeswax and pine tar. Will provide water resistance and maintain flexibility in cold. Critical for what is to come. It was at this point in November 1847 that the complaint was filed against Kincaid by the consortium of local logging operators. The document, preserved in county records, objected not merely to his unorthodox methods, but specifically cited unfair advantage in the timber market through means contrary to established practice. In essence, they were attempting to use local governance to force Kincaid to abandon his efficient system in favor of traditional approaches that would require him to hire local teamsters and their draft animals. The complaint was signed by 7 men, all established figures in the local timber industry. Chief among them was Ezra Sutton, whose logging operation was the largest in the county, employing over 20 men and maintaining 12 teams of oxen. Others included Thomas Whitley, who owned the wagons that transported processed lumber to markets downriver, James Norton, proprietor of the sawmill, and 4 additional logging operators with substantial holdings throughout the region. The language of the complaint is revealing in its attempt to frame Kincaid's innovation as somehow improper or unfair. The undersigned respectfully petition for intervention regarding the activities of one Abraham Kincaid, lately of Vermont, who has introduced practices detrimental to the established timber industry of this county. Said individual, through an excessive and unnecessarily complex arrangement of pulleys and hemp cordage, has created unfair advantage in the extraction and transport of timber, thereby undermining the livelihood of those who adhere to proper and established methods of the trade. The magistrate, Jeremiah Holcomb, appears to have been uncertain how to proceed with such a complaint. No actual law or regulation had been violated, and precedent for restricting business methods on the basis of their deviation from tradition was virtually non-existent. His response, noted in the margin of the document, reads simply, "Received and under advisement. Parties to provide specific statutory basis for requested intervention within 30 days. Kincaid, for his part, seems to have paid little attention to the complaint, focusing instead on his preparations for the coming winter and on completing one final timber extraction before the weather turned. His target was the massive walnut he had identified on the North Ridge, a specimen he estimated at over 150 years old, with a trunk that would yield lumber of extraordinary value. His journal entries from this period make no mention of the legal complaint, suggesting either that he was unaware of it or that he considered it too frivolous to merit comment. On November 24, 1847, the first snow fell on the Blue Ridge, unusually early and unexpectedly heavy. By the following morning, 6 inches of wet snow blanketed the region, with more falling steadily. Most logging operations ceased immediately, as was customary at first snowfall. Teams were brought in from the woods, equipment was stored, and the community settled in for the winter season, during which transport of goods became difficult and dangerous. Kincaid, however, proceeded with his plan to harvest the great walnut. His journal entry for November 25th reads, "Snow arrived as anticipated. Conditions difficult but manageable. Began final preparations for walnut extraction. System ready. Will proceed at first light tomorrow." The entry for November 26th provides a detailed account of this operation, one that would later be cited as the most impressive demonstration of his system's capabilities. Commenced work at dawn. Temperature 28 degrees Fahrenheit, snow continuing intermittently. Set primary anchor lines to bedrock outcropping above target. Established secondary anchor at lightning-damaged oak 40 yards west. Positioned compound pulley blocks at both anchor points and at base of walnut. Felling proceeded according to plan. Directional notch placed to utilize natural lean. Fell precisely on intended line. Trunk measured 36 inches at base, tapering to 30 inches at first major branch. Length of primary trunk before crown approximately 42 feet. Estimated weight 4,800, 5,200 pounds. Attached main lifting harness at balance point approximately 15 feet from base. Connected to primary pulley system. Initial lift required considerable effort, but system performed as designed. Once clear of ground, transferred load to traversing system. Movement along main line proceeded smoothly. Descent downslope controlled via friction brake. Total time from commencement of felling to delivery at staging area, 7 hours, 20 minutes. No assistance required, no damage to trunk. Success validates compound pulley design and justifies additional refinement of system. What Kincaid could not have anticipated, nor could anyone else in the region, was that the early snowfall of November 1847 was merely the harbinger of what would become known in local records as the Winter of Blue Death, one of the most severe weather events to strike the Appalachian region in recorded history. The name derived from the peculiar blue-tinged ice that formed on trees and structures as supercooled rain fell and instantly froze in the depths of the season's cold. The initial snowfall continued for 3 days without cessation, depositing nearly 2 feet of snow even in the lowest elevations. It was followed by a brief warming that turned the top layers to slush, then a sudden and severe temperature drop that transformed the entire landscape into a sheet of ice. By December 5th, the temperature had plunged to unprecedented lows. The limited thermometric records available suggest readings of 10 to 15 degrees below zero Fahrenheit, extraordinary for the region. More significantly, the severe weather disrupted the established patterns of frontier life. The roads to larger settlements became impassable. Streams froze solid, halting the water wheels that powered the mills. Wildlife vanished from the forests as they sought shelter in deep ravines and caves. And most critically, the normal supply lines that brought essential goods to the community were completely severed. Ezra Sutton's personal diary, preserved by his descendants and made available to historians in 1957, provides a first-hand account of the deteriorating conditions. Dickus 12, no mail for 16 days, no supplies from Liberty, flour running low throughout settlement. Jenkins reports several neighbors taking ill with fever. No medicine available. Temperature remains bitter. Firewood consumption exceeding all expectation. An entry from December 15th further illustrates the escalating crisis. Barnes lost 2 oxen today, found frozen in their pen despite shelter. Never witnessed such cold in 23 years in these mountains. Wilson reports his well frozen to a depth of 6 inches. Must melt snow for water. Brooks attempted journey to Liberty for supplies, but turned back at Sawyer's Creek. Reports trail completely impassable due to ice sheet. By mid-December, what had begun as mere inconvenience was evolving into a potential catastrophe. Multiple families had insufficient firewood to maintain adequate heating. The community's shared reserves of flour, salt, and other staples were rapidly depleting. Several elderly residents had developed severe respiratory ailments due to the cold and malnutrition. The situation was exacerbated by the physical layout of the settlement. Homesteads were widely scattered across the landscape, with some located miles from their nearest neighbors. The ice-covered terrain made travel between households treacherous and, in some cases, impossible. Families accustomed to self-reliance found themselves isolated and vulnerable as their individual reserves dwindled. On December 18th, 3 weeks into the crisis, community leaders managed to convene an emergency meeting at the centrally located church. The minutes of this meeting, recorded by Deacon William Harper, reveal the gravity of the situation. Consensus that conditions most dire. Without resumption of supply lines or significant improvement in weather, many households will face critical shortages within 10 to 14 days. Discussion of potential evacuation to Liberty abandoned due to impassable conditions of mountain roads. Prayer offered for divine intervention. It was at this meeting that Abraham Kincaid, previously marginalized as an eccentric outsider, offered a solution that would transform his standing in the community. According to Harper's minutes, Kincaid proposed using his rope and pulley systems, the very contrivances that had been the subject of complaint and derision, to create a network for transporting supplies between isolated homesteads and bringing timber from the forests to households with depleted wood piles. The initial response was skeptical. Ezra Sutton is recorded as saying, "Your spider webs may move logs in fair weather, but they'll be useless in this ice." Kincaid reportedly replied, "My system was built with winter in mind. The ice is an inconvenience, not an insurmountable obstacle." The exchange continued, with others expressing doubt about the practicality of establishing such a network under current conditions. Kincaid responded by explaining that many of the necessary anchor points were already in place as part of his timber extraction system. He further noted that the ice, while dangerous for conventional travel, actually provided certain advantages for his system by creating solid surfaces where muddy ground might otherwise create difficulties. Faced with few alternatives, the community reluctantly accepted Kincaid's offer. The following day, Kincaid led a small team of men to adapt and extend his rope systems. His journal provides detailed descriptions of the modifications. Document 19 established new anchor point at Harper's Oak, extended main line 3 to 20 yards to connect with church grounds. System now capable of transporting up to 200 pounds of supplies across ice field that has proven impassable on foot. Instructed Harper and Sutton in basic operation, both skeptical but willing to learn. Harper grasps principles readily, Sutton less so, but compensates with practical suggestions regarding load balancing. The church records from this period contain a hastily composed inventory of community resources, revealing the precariousness of their situation. The settlement of approximately 120 individuals had collectively 14 barrels of flour, roughly half the normal winter supply, 8 barrels of salt pork, 6 sacks of dried beans, 12 barrels of apples, miscellaneous preserves and dried fruits in individual households, approximately 30 cords of cut firewood distributed among households, with some nearly depleted. More troubling, 3 households reported complete exhaustion of their firewood supplies, and 5 more estimated less than a week's worth remaining. Given the extreme temperatures, this shortage posed an immediate threat to survival. Over the next several days, Kincaid's system was further expanded. Using the trees themselves as natural towers, he created a rudimentary network of elevated rope lines that connected key points in the community: the church, the mill, several of the more isolated homesteads, and most importantly, his own property with its abundant stockpile of firewood and other supplies. The system worked on the same principles as his logging apparatus, but adapted for different purposes. Heavy items like firewood could be bundled and moved along the main lines using the mechanical advantage of his pulley systems. Smaller items like food, medicine, or mail could be sent in canvas bags that traveled along the ropes, controlled by smaller guidelines. Kincaid's journal entries detail the technical adaptations required for this expanded application. Decks 20. Fabricated new friction brake for church-to-mill line, used oak with iron facing to withstand continuous use. Critical for controlling descent of heavier loads, particularly firewood bundles. Tested with 150-pound sandbag. Performance satisfactory. Deckies 21. Modified canvas transport bags for food shipments. Double-layered construction with waterproof lining. Canvas treated with beeswax pine tar mixture. Closures secured with wooden toggles rather than knots. Easier to manipulate with cold hands. Size standardized at 24x36 with capacity of approximately 40 pounds. Discrete 22. Established signal system for coordinating operations between distant points. Bell at church, single ring, prepare to receive, double ring, commence transport, triple ring, emergency stop. Flags at intermediate points, red, line occupied, white, line clear. System functional though crude. Will improve as conditions permit. By Christmas Day 1847, Kincaid's network was fully operational. The church bell, normally used only for Sunday services and emergencies, was repurposed to signal when the system was in use and to coordinate activities between distant points. A log entry from the church record notes, December 25, first full distribution via Kincaid's ropes. 14 families received firewood sufficient for 3 days. 8 families received flour and salt. Harper's medicine chest transported to Jenkins' household for treatment of the ill. Thanks be to God and to the ingenuity He has blessed upon our community. The significance of this development cannot be overstated. In an environment where conventional transportation had become impossible, Kincaid's system created a lifeline that allowed the community to share resources and provide assistance to its most vulnerable members. Households with surplus supplies could easily transfer them to those in need. Medical attention could be summoned without requiring dangerous journeys. And perhaps most critically, Kincaid's abundant firewood stockpile could be distributed to those whose supplies had been exhausted. As January 1848 arrived with no improvement in conditions, indeed with further snowfall and even lower temperatures, Kincaid's system became the community's lifeline. His journal entries from this period show a shift from his solitary focus on his own projects to a broader concern for the community's welfare. Jan. 4. Extended tertiary line to Widow Patterson's homestead. Difficult terrain but accomplished with double anchor at midpoint. Can now deliver directly to her door, saving her the dangerous walk to church distribution point. And later, Jan. 10. Modified pulley block for main line to increase capacity. Now capable of moving 300 pounds per load, sufficient for quarter cord of firewood. Still requires 2 men at origin and 2 at destination, but working smoothly. Sutton has proven particularly adept at managing the brake line. The reference to Ezra Sutton, who had been among Kincaid's most vocal critics and a lead signatory on the complaint, is particularly telling. Throughout January, as the system proved its worth day after day, the tone of community records shifts noticeably. What had been described as Kincaid's contraption, or the Yankees' spider web, was now respectfully documented as the transportation system, or simply the lines. Sutton's own diary reflects this evolution in attitude. His entry from January 15th reads, "Assisted K with distribution today. System transported 800 pounds of firewood to 4 families in under 3 hours. Could not have been accomplished by conventional means under present conditions." The man's foresight in rope preparation is remarkable. Flexibility maintained despite bitter cold that makes leather brittle as glass. Perhaps most significantly, the experienced teamsters and logging operators who had initially dismissed Kincaid's methods began to actively engage with his system, offering improvements based on their own expertise. Thomas Whitley suggested modifications to the braking mechanism that Kincaid adopted and acknowledged in his journal, "Whitley's friction brake much superior to my original design. Implemented on all main lines, reduces strain on operators and allows more precise control of heavy loads." James Norton, the sawmill operator, contributed a design for a more efficient loading platform that integrated with the pulley systems. William Harper applied his carpentry skills to creating standardized containers for different types of goods. Even Ezra Sutton, initially the most vocal skeptic, developed a method for quickly attaching and detaching loads that reduced the time required for each transport operation. This collaborative refinement of the system transformed it from Kincaid's personal innovation into a community resource. The church records began to include a daily transport schedule, allocating specific time periods for different types of deliveries and designating operators for each segment of the network. Families took turns staffing the system, with those who had received assistance expected to contribute labor when physically able. A particularly poignant example of the system's impact appears in a letter preserved in the Jenkins Family Bible, dated January 20th, 1848. "Were it not for Mr. Kincaid's ropes bringing Dr. Harper's medicines and Mrs. Sutton's broths, our little Samuel would surely have perished from the fever. The Lord works in mysterious ways, sending salvation through means we once mocked." By early February, after more than 2 months of unrelenting winter conditions, the community had not only survived but had developed a new pattern of cooperation centered around Kincaid's innovation. No deaths had been recorded despite the extreme conditions, an outcome that the visiting circuit preacher described as nothing short of miraculous in his report to regional church authorities. It was during this period that the complaint against Kincaid was formally withdrawn. The document itself offers no explanation, but Ezra Sutton's diary provides context. February 8, visited magistrate with Harper and others to withdraw our petition against Kincaid's methods. What we mistook for excessive complication has proven to be necessary sophistication. The man's foresight has preserved this community when our traditional approaches would have failed us. There is a lesson in this that I am still working to fully comprehend. The magistrate's notation on the withdrawal is equally telling. Petition withdrawn by unanimous consent of original complainants. Matter closed. N. Beecher, remarkable to observe such unanimity among men, typically in vigorous competition. The winter finally broke in late February 1848. As temperatures moderated and ice began to melt, roads gradually became passable again. On March 4th, the first supply wagon from Liberty reached the settlement, restoring the connection to the wider world. The immediate crisis had passed, but the impact of Kincaid's system and of the community's experience that winter proved to be enduring. Rather than dismantling the rope network as conditions improved, the community decided to maintain and even expand it. A committee was formed, with Kincaid as technical advisor, to establish permanent anchor points and standardized equipment. County records from April 1848 include a petition from the settlement to establish what they termed a community transport authority, with the right to establish rope lines across private properties where necessary for the common good. The petition was granted, creating one of the earliest examples of a communal utility right-of-way in the region. Throughout the spring and summer of 1848, Kincaid's workshop became an informal school of sorts. His journal notes regular sessions where he instructed community members in the principles of mechanical advantage, rope maintenance, and system operations. May 15th, conducted third training session. 12 attendees from the community. Covered compound pulley configurations and calculation of mechanical advantage. Newcomers grasp the mathematics readily. Older men understand the practical applications, but struggle with abstract principles, all making progress. The curriculum of these sessions, as reconstructed from Kincaid's notes, was surprisingly comprehensive. It began with basic principles of mechanical advantage and simple machines, progressed through the properties and maintenance of different types of rope, and culminated in the design and construction of complex pulley systems. Participants learned not only how to operate the existing system, but how to expand it, repair it, and adapt it for new applications. A particularly interesting aspect of this knowledge transfer was Kincaid's insistence on proper documentation. He taught community members to keep detailed records of the system's components, to create accurate maps of the rope lines, and to maintain logs of maintenance activities. This emphasis on documentation, unusual in a frontier setting where practical knowledge was typically transmitted through demonstration and apprenticeship, ensured that the knowledge would persist even if key individuals were no longer present. The true validation of Kincaid's approach came the following winter. While not as severe as the Blue Death of 1847-48, the winter of 1848-49 brought its own challenges. This time, the community was prepared. The rope transport system, now expanded and improved, was activated at the first heavy snowfall. Supply caches had been established at strategic points, and a rotation of trained operators ensured that the system could function as needed. The mill records from December 1848 note that despite heavy snow, timber continued to move from forest to sawmill via the community's rope lines, allowing limited production to continue through conditions that would have previously halted all operations. More importantly, no households experienced critical shortages of firewood, food, or other necessities. In an 1849 letter to his brother in Vermont, preserved in the family collection, Kincaid reflected on the transformation. What began as my personal solution to a specific challenge has become something much more significant. The system now connects 23 homesteads across nearly 4 miles of difficult terrain. More remarkable than the physical infrastructure is the change in the community itself. Men who once viewed my methods with suspicion now contribute improvements I would not have conceived. There is a recognition that preparation is not merely prudence, but responsibility to one's neighbors. By 1850, what had begun as Kincaid's personal innovation had evolved into a defining characteristic of the settlement. Visitors remarked on the unusual sight of rope lines stretching between tall trees, and the community became known regionally as Rope Town, though this informal name never replaced its official designation. A traveler's account published in the Southern Literary Messenger in October 1850 describes the scene. Upon approaching the settlement, one is struck by the singular appearance of ropes suspended high among the trees, creating a network that connects the scattered dwellings. At intervals along these lines are ingenious mechanical arrangements that allow for the transport of goods without the necessity of traversing the rugged terrain. The inhabitants operate this system with remarkable efficiency, sending everything from mail to firewood along the elevated pathways. Most curious to the observer is the evident pride with which they demonstrate their unusual method of conveyance, a stark contrast to the typical frontier suspicion of novelty. The system's influence spread beyond the immediate area. Detailed descriptions of Kincaid's methods were published at the Farmer's Almanac in 1851, and similar systems began to appear in other mountain communities throughout the Appalachians. A particularly extensive network was established in a mining community in western Pennsylvania, where Kincaid was hired as a consultant in 1853 to design a system for moving equipment and ore across steep terrain. The Pennsylvania system, as described in contemporary accounts, incorporated several advancements beyond Kincaid's original design. It utilized metal cables rather than hemp rope for the main lines, increasing both capacity and durability. The pulley mechanisms were fabricated from cast iron rather than wood, with precision machined bearings that reduced friction. And perhaps most significantly, it included a rudimentary braking system that allowed for more precise control of heavy loads moving downhill, a critical safety feature in a mining environment where the consequences of failure could be catastrophic. The success of these adaptations led to further refinements in Kincaid's own community. By 1855, portions of the original hemp rope system had been replaced with wire cable, and many of the wooden components had been upgraded to metal equivalents. These improvements increased both the capacity and the reliability of the system, allowing it to handle larger loads and operate in more extreme conditions. Abraham Kincaid continued to refine his system until his death in 1876. His final journal entry, dated just 3 days before his passing at age 68, reflects on the journey from ridicule to acceptance. What was once seen as excessive complexity is now recognized as necessary thoroughness. The forest and the mountain do not yield their treasures to half measures or casual approaches. Nature demands respect, preparation, and humility. I hope I have demonstrated the value of these principles. An inventory of Kincaid's estate, conducted as part of the probate process, reveals the extent of his continued innovation even in his later years. His workshop contained prototypes for several devices that were decades ahead of their time, including a self-adjusting tension system for maintaining optimal rope tightness under varying loads and weather conditions, and a signaling device that used mechanical triggers to alert operators when a transport was approaching their station. Most intriguingly, his final journals include sketches and calculations for what he termed a continuous circuit system, essentially a primitive cableway or ropeway that would allow for constant movement rather than the batch transport of the existing design. While never implemented during his lifetime, this concept bears striking similarities to the aerial ropeways that would become common in mining and logging operations in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The physical remnants of Kincaid's original system have long since disappeared from the landscape. The ropes deteriorated, the wooden components rotted, and the metal fittings were eventually reclaimed for other purposes. But the technical drawings in his journal, preserved by his descendants and ultimately donated to the Virginia Historical Society, provide a detailed record of his innovations. A metallurgical analysis conducted in 1965 on one of the few surviving iron pulleys from Kincaid's workshop revealed another aspect of his foresight. The pulley showed evidence of having been case-hardened, using a carburizing technique that was not commonly employed in American manufacturing until decades later. This suggests that Kincaid had brought not only unusual equipment from his previous life in Vermont, but also advanced knowledge of metallurgy that was ahead of its time. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of Kincaid's system was not physical, but cultural. The experience of the Winter of Blue Death and the community's subsequent embrace of Kincaid's innovation created a lasting tradition of preparedness and collaborative problem-solving that distinguished the settlement from many of its neighbors. Church records from the 1850s and 1860s include annual preparation committees charged with ensuring that the community had adequate reserves for winter emergencies. Mill records show the establishment of a communal timber reserve, a portion of each year's harvest set aside specifically to ensure that no household would lack firewood regardless of individual circumstances. A school primer from 1865, preserved in the County Historical Collection, includes a section titled Mr. Straub. Kincaid's lessons, which summarizes these principles. 1. Observe thoroughly before acting. Knowledge of the land and weather are as important as skill with tools. 2. Prepare beyond what seems necessary. Nature tests not the average challenge, but the exceptional one. 3. Simple is not always best. The right tool for a difficult job may appear complex to those who have not studied the problem. 4. Share knowledge freely. Wisdom kept to oneself serves only one, but wisdom shared serves all. What began as one man's excessive and unnecessarily complex arrangement ultimately became a testament to the value of thorough preparation and innovative thinking in frontier environments where conventional methods could falter under extreme conditions. The story of Abraham Kincaid's rope system offers several enduring lessons about frontier life and adaptation. First, it demonstrates that true preparation often appears excessive until its necessity becomes apparent. Kincaid's stockpiling of supplies and elaborate rope systems seemed unnecessary during fair weather, but proved life-saving when conditions deteriorated beyond normal expectations. Second, it illustrates how innovation often faces resistance, particularly when it challenges established methods. The initial rejection of Kincaid's approach by experienced loggers reflected not just skepticism about its effectiveness, but also a deeper discomfort with change and with acknowledging that traditional knowledge might have limitations. Third, it shows how crisis can serve as the ultimate proving ground for new ideas. The severe winter created conditions where traditional methods were rendered ineffective, forcing the community to embrace an alternative that they had previously rejected. Fourth, it reveals how knowledge transfer and community adaptation can transform individual innovation into collective resilience. What began as one man's unusual approach became, through teaching and collaboration, a community resource that continued to provide benefit long after the initial crisis had passed. Finally, it underscores the moral dimension of preparation and innovation on the frontier. Kincaid's system ultimately saved lives, not because it was more efficient or economical, but because its creator had the foresight to prepare for conditions beyond the norm and the generosity to share his creation when needed most. This pattern, initial rejection of innovation, followed by crisis-driven acceptance, leading to broader adoption and adaptation, has repeated throughout American frontier history. From unusual agricultural techniques to unconventional building methods, many practices that eventually became standard were first championed by individuals who, like Kincaid, were willing to endure skepticism and even ridicule while pursuing approaches they believed to be superior. The historian David McCullough, commenting on the Kincaid Journal after examining it in 1968, noted, "What strikes me about this account is not just the technical ingenuity, which was considerable, but the moral courage required to persist with an approach that invited derision from one's neighbors. Frontier life required physical bravery, certainly, but it also demanded the fortitude to stand apart when necessary, to follow one's own judgment, even when conventional wisdom pointed elsewhere." The Blue Ridge community that Kincaid helped to save eventually dispersed as economic patterns shifted. The advent of steam power and railroads transformed logging operations, making the remote mountain setting less economically viable for timber harvesting. By the early 1900s, many families had moved to larger settlements, seeking new opportunities. But the legacy of Kincaid's system persisted in unexpected ways. His great-grandson, Thomas Kincaid, became a pioneering cable car engineer in San Francisco during the early 20th century, applying principles of rope mechanics first documented in Abraham's Journal to urban transportation challenges. And throughout the Appalachian region, variations of rope transport systems continued to be used in isolated areas well into the 1940s, particularly in situations where road construction was impractical due to terrain. A survey conducted by the Works Progress Administration in 1937 identified 14 still functioning rope transport systems in remote communities across Virginia, West Virginia, and North Carolina. These systems, while primitive by modern standards, continued to serve vital functions in areas where conventional transportation remained challenging. Most were used primarily during winter months when roads became impassable, exactly as Kincaid's original system had been. Interestingly, several of these systems showed evidence of direct lineage from Kincaid's original design. The characteristic compound pulley arrangement, the specific method of anchoring to trees, and even the signal systems used to coordinate operations all bore striking similarities to the details recorded in Kincaid's journal. This suggests that his innovation had spread through the region not just as a general concept, but with specific technical details intact, a testament to the effectiveness of his original design and to the thoroughness of his documentation. The last of these traditional rope transport systems was finally dismantled in 1952 rendered obsolete by improved road networks and the increasing availability of motorized transportation. But the principles underlying Kincaid's innovation found new applications in modern aerial tramways, ski lifts, and industrial material handling systems, technologies that continue to employ the fundamental concepts of mechanical advantage and elevated transport that he pioneered in his remote mountain setting. Perhaps the most fitting epilogue to Kincaid's story comes from a 1967 interview with Eleanor Sutton Patterson, a then elderly descendant of Ezra Sutton, who had heard the tale from her grandfather. The lesson my granddaddy took from that terrible winter was simple but profound. He said, "Never mistake complexity for waste, and never confuse good fortune with good planning." He had always prided himself on doing things the straightforward way. But after that winter, he'd add, straightforward isn't always the same as adequate. In an age increasingly dominated by technological solutions, Kincaid's story offers a nuanced perspective on innovation. It reminds us that new approaches should be evaluated not by their conformity to tradition or by their apparent complexity, but by their effectiveness in addressing real challenges. It suggests that preparation, though often invisible until needed, may be the most essential form of problem-solving. And finally, it demonstrates that the frontier, whether geographical, intellectual, or technological, is best navigated not by rigid adherence to established methods, but by thoughtful adaptation and a willingness to imagine new possibilities, even when those possibilities initially appear unnecessarily complex or contrary to conventional wisdom. The mountain slopes where Abraham Kincaid once strung his innovative rope systems are now part of the George Washington National Forest. Hikers occasionally discover iron spikes embedded in ancient trees or rusted hardware half buried in the forest floor, physical reminders of a system that once transported life-saving supplies through the frozen landscape. These artifacts, like the story itself, stand as testament to the ingenuity, foresight, and adaptability that characterized the best of America's frontier spirit. In the decades following Kincaid's death, his legacy continued to evolve in ways that even he might not have anticipated. While the immediate physical implementation of his system gradually faded from use, the principles and philosophy behind it took root in various forms throughout the region and beyond. By the turn of the century, as industrial logging operations began to replace the smaller-scale approaches that had characterized the frontier era, elements of Kincaid's system found unexpected applications. The Baldwin Logging Company, which established operations in Western Virginia in 1889, implemented a modified version of Kincaid's rope transport system for moving timber across deep ravines where conventional methods proved impractical. Company records from 1892 explicitly reference the Kincaid method, suggesting that his innovation had by then become recognized terminology within the industry. More significant than these direct applications, however, was the broader influence of Kincaid's approach to problem-solving. The meticulous observation, careful preparation, and willingness to defy convention that characterized his work became embedded in the regional culture, particularly in how communities approached the challenges of mountain life. A survey conducted by the Department of Agriculture in 1912 noted that communities in the central and southern Appalachians exhibited unusual preparedness for seasonal extremes compared to similar rural populations elsewhere. The report specifically observed that these communities maintained food and fuel reserves significantly in excess of apparent need and demonstrated remarkable adaptability in transportation methods during adverse conditions. While the report made no direct connection to Kincaid's influence, the geographical correlation with areas where his methods had spread is suggestive. The educational impact of Kincaid's legacy proved particularly enduring. By the early 1900s, several rural schools in the region had incorporated what they termed practical mechanics into their curriculum, a subject that combined basic physics with hands-on application to solve common challenges of mountain life. A teaching manual from 1908, preserved in the Virginia State Library, includes lessons on calculating mechanical advantage, constructing simple pulley systems, and evaluating the strength requirements for various loads, all concepts directly traceable to Kincaid's original work. This educational thread continued well into the 20th century, when the Civilian Conservation Corps established camps in the Blue Ridge region during the 1930s. Local instructors were brought in to teach traditional mountain engineering solutions. CCC records indicate that several projects incorporated rope-based transport systems for moving materials across difficult terrain, systems described as local methods, but clearly descended from Kincaid's original innovation. The advent of modern technology gradually rendered such traditional approaches obsolete for most practical applications. The expansion of road networks, the availability of motorized vehicles capable of navigating difficult terrain, and the development of industrial-scale logging equipment all contributed to the decline of rope-based transport systems. By the mid-20th century, the practical legacy of Kincaid's innovation survived primarily in specialized contexts, such as rescue operations and recreational activities like rock climbing. However, the philosophical and cultural aspects of his legacy proved more resilient. The values embodied in his approach, thorough preparation, careful observation, innovative problem-solving, and community cooperation, continued to characterize the best aspects of Appalachian culture. These values found expression in various forms, from the region's distinctive musical traditions that celebrated self-reliance and ingenuity to its approach to natural resource management that often emphasized sustainability long before it became a broader cultural concern. In 1957, when devastating floods struck the Blue Ridge region, communities that could trace their cultural lineage to settlements influenced by Kincaid's methods demonstrated remarkable resilience. Contemporary accounts noted their effective evacuation procedures, well-maintained emergency supply caches, and coordinated community response, all elements that reflected the long-term impact of lessons learned during the Winter of Blue Death more than a century earlier. The academic study of Kincaid's innovation began in earnest in the 1960s, when historians and engineers first gained access to his complete journals through the Virginia Historical Society. A dissertation completed at Virginia Polytechnic Institute in 1964 provided the first comprehensive technical analysis of his pulley systems, confirming that several of his design elements had independently anticipated developments that would not become standard in industrial applications until decades after his work. This academic interest expanded in subsequent years to include anthropological and sociological perspectives. A study published in the Journal of Appalachian Studies in 1972 examined the social dynamics of innovation acceptance in frontier communities, using Kincaid's experience as a primary case study. The author noted that the pattern of initial rejection, followed by crisis-driven acceptance, followed by cultural integration, represented a recurring theme in how isolated communities respond to technological change. By the 1980s, Kincaid's story had begun to attract attention from beyond academic circles. A feature article in Popular Mechanics in 1984 brought his innovation to a wider audience, describing him as the forgotten genius of mountain engineering. The article included modern recreations of his pulley designs, noting that they achieved efficiency ratings comparable to much later industrial developments. In 1992, a small museum dedicated to Blue Ridge industrial history opened an exhibit focused on Kincaid's rope system. The centerpiece of the exhibition was a working scale model that demonstrated the principles of his design, alongside reproductions of his technical drawings and excerpts from his journal. The exhibit proved unexpectedly popular, attracting visitors from throughout the region and contributing to a renewed interest in traditional mountain technologies. This revival of interest coincided with a broader cultural movement toward appreciation of traditional knowledge and sustainable technologies. In an era increasingly concerned with environmental impact and resource conservation, Kincaid's approach, which minimized landscape disruption while maximizing efficiency, began to resonate with contemporary values in ways that would have been difficult to anticipate during his lifetime. A particularly interesting manifestation of this renewed relevance emerged in the early 2000s, when several eco-conscious forestry operations in the Appalachian region began experimenting with modern adaptations of Kincaid's methods. These operations, focused on selective harvesting rather than clear-cutting, found that cable-based systems inspired by Kincaid's original design allowed for timber extraction with minimal impact on forest ecosystems. A study published in the Journal of Sustainable Forestry in 2008 documented these applications, noting that they represented a remarkable rediscovery of traditional wisdom in addressing contemporary challenges. The digital age has further extended Kincaid's influence in unexpected ways. His journals, digitized by the Virginia Historical Society in 2010, have become accessible to a global audience of historians, engineers, and enthusiasts. Online forums dedicated to traditional technologies and lost arts frequently reference his work, with participants from around the world attempting to recreate and refine his designs using modern materials. In 2015, a team of engineering students at Virginia Tech created a computer simulation of Kincaid's system, allowing for precise analysis of its mechanical properties. Their findings confirmed what practitioners had long suspected. The system achieved remarkable efficiency through what the students termed elegant simplicity, an approach that maximized output while minimizing complexity. The project report concluded that Kincaid's designs embodied principles of sustainable engineering that remained relevant in the 21st century. The story of Abraham Kincaid and his innovative rope system has thus come full circle. What began as one man's solution to a specific challenge, initially dismissed as unnecessary complexity, has been recognized not merely as a historical curiosity, but as an embodiment of principles that transcend their original context. In an age facing its own unprecedented challenges, climate change, resource depletion, and the need for sustainable development, the example of thoughtful adaptation and community resilience represented by Kincaid's innovation offers lessons that remain surprisingly pertinent. As we reflect on this remarkable frontier tale, several themes emerge that speak directly to contemporary concerns. Kincaid's emphasis on thorough preparation and resilient design anticipated our modern understanding of adaptation to extreme conditions, an increasingly relevant concept in an era of climate uncertainty. His focus on efficiency and minimal environmental impact aligns with current priorities in sustainable development. And perhaps most significantly, the community's eventual embrace of his innovation demonstrates how crisis can catalyze positive change, transforming resistance into acceptance and ultimately into cultural integration. The mountain slopes where Abraham Kincaid once strung his innovative rope systems are now part of the George Washington National Forest. Hikers occasionally discover iron spikes embedded in ancient trees or rusted hardware half buried in the forest floor, physical reminders of a system that once transported life-saving supplies through the frozen landscape. These artifacts, like the story itself, stand as testament to the ingenuity, foresight, and adaptability that characterized the best of America's frontier spirit. The technical ingenuity behind Kincaid's rope system deserves closer examination, as it represents a remarkable synthesis of maritime knowledge, mechanical principles, and practical adaptation to the specific challenges of mountain forestry. While the basic concept of pulley systems dated back to ancient times, Kincaid's particular implementation incorporated several innovations that set it apart from conventional approaches of his era. The heart of his system was what he called the differential pulley block, a device that combined pulleys of different diameters on a single axle. This arrangement created variable mechanical advantage within a single component, allowing for precise control of both speed and force. In his journal, Kincaid provides detailed calculations for determining the optimal diameter ratios based on specific load requirements and terrain conditions. For example, an entry from June 1846 notes, "For north slope extraction, 4:1 diameter ratio provides ideal balance between effort required and control precision. Smaller ratio insufficient for steeper sections. Larger ratio makes control too sensitive on lesser grades." These calculations were far from theoretical abstractions. Each was tied directly to specific features of his property: the angle of a particular slope, the distance between anchor points, the average weight of timber from a specific stand. This ground truth approach to engineering, combining mathematical precision with intimate knowledge of the local environment, enabled Kincaid to optimize his system for maximum efficiency in ways that generalized designs could not achieve. Equally significant was his approach to the ropes themselves. While most frontier applications used standard hemp rope with little modification, Kincaid developed specialized treatments and construction techniques that dramatically improved performance. His journal describes a multi-stage process for preparing rope that included initial soaking in a solution of alum and salt to remove impurities, followed by application of his proprietary mixture of beeswax, pine tar, and linseed oil to improve weather resistance and flexibility. Beyond these treatments, Kincaid experimented extensively with different braiding patterns. Traditional rope of the period typically used a simple three-strand twist pattern, but Kincaid's journals document his trials with more complex arrangements involving 4, 6, and even 8 strands. An entry from August 1846 notes, 8-strand square braid with alternating Z and S twists shows 30% greater tensile strength than standard 3-strand. More labor-intensive to produce, but justified for main support lines where failure cannot be tolerated. His attention to terminal connections, the points where ropes attached to loads or anchor points, was particularly noteworthy. Conventional wisdom of the time relied heavily on knots, which could reduce a rope's strength by 40% or more at the connection point. Kincaid instead developed what he called integrated terminals, spliced connections that distributed stress more evenly through a graduated transition. His technical drawings show a method involving progressive interweaving of strands over a tapered wooden form, creating a connection that maintained over 90% of the rope's original strength. The anchoring system for his rope network demonstrated equal attention to detail. Rather than relying solely on trees, the obvious but sometimes unreliable anchor points in a forested environment, Kincaid established a network of what he termed composite anchors. These combined natural features, trees, rock outcroppings, with engineered elements, driven iron spikes, stone-filled cribs, to create anchor points that could withstand forces from multiple directions and adapt to changing conditions. A particularly ingenious element was his self-adjusting tension system, a counterweight arrangement that automatically maintained optimal tension in the main support lines despite changes in temperature, humidity, and load. This system used suspended weights configured to exert consistent force, regardless of how much the rope stretched or contracted with weather conditions. An entry from October 1846 explains, 40-pound stone suspended at midpoint via secondary pulley maintains consistent tension regardless of moisture content. Line remains taut in morning dew and midday dry conditions alike. Critical for maintaining system geometry and preventing dangerous slack. The operational aspects of Kincaid's system were equally well considered. His journals describe a methodical approach to each timber extraction, beginning with careful evaluation of the specific tree and surrounding terrain. Before a single cut was made, Kincaid would establish primary and secondary extraction paths, position all necessary equipment, and even conduct small-scale tests to verify that the system was properly configured for the particular challenge at hand. This methodical approach extended to safety considerations as well. Kincaid developed what he called controlled failure points, deliberately weakened connections at strategic locations that would break in predictable ways if the system became overloaded. This feature, remarkably similar to modern engineering concepts like crumple zones or fuse points, ensured that any failure would occur in a manner and location that minimized risk to the operator. An entry from July 1847 notes, "Incorporated sacrificial link at junction point. Will fail at approximately 120% of maximum anticipated load, allowing controlled release rather than catastrophic system collapse. Tested successfully with intentional overload." When the winter of Blue Death transformed Kincaid's personal innovation into a community lifeline, these technical aspects took on new significance. Features that had been developed for efficiency in timber extraction proved remarkably adaptable to the emergency needs of a community in crisis. The differential pulley blocks that had been designed to move massive logs could be reconfigured to provide even greater mechanical advantage for smaller, more frequent loads of firewood and supplies. The weather-resistant rope treatments that had been developed for durability in normal operations became essential for maintaining functionality in extreme cold. And the methodical documentation that had seemed excessive to his neighbors became the foundation for rapidly training others to operate and expand the system. The community's gradual embrace of Kincaid's innovation during this crisis revealed social dynamics that were as complex as the technical aspects of his system. The initial resistance had been rooted not merely in skepticism about functionality, but in deeper cultural values and economic interests. Traditional logging methods were labor-intensive, creating employment for many community members and maintaining established power structures. Kincaid's approach, which allowed a single operator to accomplish what would normally require several men and draft animals, represented a potential threat to this economic ecosystem. The church records from December 1847, when the community reluctantly accepted Kincaid's offer of assistance, reveal the tension between necessity and resistance. Deacon Harper's careful notation that the acceptance was temporary and exceptional, not to be construed as endorsement of the method for normal conditions, suggests the depth of concern about long-term implications. Similarly, Ezra Sutton's initial insistence that community members receive proper compensation for their role in operating the system indicated ongoing anxiety about economic disruption. What transformed this reluctant acceptance into genuine embrace was the lived experience of cooperation during crisis. As community members worked together to operate, maintain, and expand the rope network, traditional social boundaries began to blur. Skilled teamsters found themselves learning from the previously dismissed Yankee theorist. Established community leaders worked alongside newcomers and those of lower social standing. Women, normally excluded from technical domains, became essential participants in the system's operation, particularly in coordinating communications between distant points. The Diary of Sarah Jenkins, wife of one of the settlement's founding families, provides a particularly valuable perspective on this transformation. January 14, 1848. Served as signal coordinator at Church Hub today, directed traffic across all 7 lines, ensuring no conflicts or delays. Mr. Kincaid has asked me to document our procedures for training others. Strange to be consulted on such matters by men who would scarcely acknowledge my presence before the snow came. By February, as the crisis continued, these new patterns of cooperation had begun to solidify into more permanent social changes. The church minutes from February 6th note the establishment of a transportation committee with membership that crossed traditional social boundaries. Ezra Sutton, the wealthy logging operator, served alongside Samuel Wilson, a tenant farmer. Mary Harper, the deacon's wife, was named record keeper, and Kincaid himself was designated technical advisor, a formal acknowledgement of his expertise that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. The withdrawal of the complaint against Kincaid's methods in early February represented more than a legal formality. It signified a fundamental reevaluation of values within the community, a shift from reflexive adherence to tradition toward a more adaptive approach that evaluated methods based on results rather than conformity to established practice. Ezra Sutton's diary entry describing what he had mistook for excessive complication as necessary sophistication captures this philosophical transformation. When spring finally arrived and the immediate crisis passed, the community faced a choice about whether to dismantle the rope system or maintain it as part of their ongoing infrastructure. The decision to not only preserve but expand the network reflected both practical assessment of its utility and a deeper cultural shift in how the community viewed innovation, preparation, and cooperation. The petition to establish the Community Transport Authority in April 1848 is particularly revealing in this regard. Unlike most frontier governance structures, which typically focused on maintaining boundaries and regulating behavior, this new entity was explicitly created to facilitate shared resources and collaborative action. The language of the petition emphasized the system's role in binding together the scattered homesteads of our settlement, a phrase that carried both literal and metaphorical significance. Throughout the summer and fall of 1848, as Kincaid conducted his informal training sessions in the principles of mechanical advantage and system operations, he was doing more than transferring technical knowledge. He was helping to institutionalize a new approach to community problem-solving, one that valued preparation, cooperation, and innovation over tradition and individual self-sufficiency. The rapid acceptance of these lessons among community members suggests that they resonated with emerging needs and values in ways that traditional approaches could not match. By the time the winter of 1848-49 arrived, the transformation was complete. The rope system, once viewed as an eccentric outsider's unnecessary complexity, had become a point of community pride and identity. Visitors to the settlement during this period recorded their surprise at hearing local residents enthusiastically explaining the technical details of the system, details many had dismissed or mocked just a year earlier. A traveler's account from January 1849, preserved in the Virginia Historical Society collection, captures this transformation. Most curious is the manner in which these mountain folk speak of their rope transport system, with a proprietary pride more commonly associated with church or town hall. When I expressed surprise at seeing goods and persons move through the air by these means, my host embarked upon a detailed explanation of mechanical principles that would not have been out of place in a Philadelphia lecture hall. When I inquired as to the origin of this unusual arrangement, he acknowledged it began with the Yankee fellow, but quickly added, though we've all had a hand in improving it since. One senses a community that has not merely adopted a technique, but incorporated it into their very identity. This integration of Kincaid's innovation into community identity had long-lasting effects on how the settlement developed in subsequent decades. While many frontier communities struggled with the transition to more modern economic and social patterns, the Ropetown settlement demonstrated unusual adaptability. When the timber industry began to modernize in the 1870s and 1880s, the community's familiarity with mechanical systems and openness to innovation allowed it to adapt more readily than many of its neighbors. When new transportation technologies emerged, from improved wagon designs to early automobiles, the settlement quickly incorporated them, not abandoning their rope system, but integrating new approaches alongside it as appropriate for different needs. The educational legacy was particularly significant. An evaluation conducted by the Virginia Department of Education in 1915 noted that students from the settlement demonstrated exceptional aptitude in applied mathematics and mechanical reasoning compared to those from similar rural communities, a difference attributed to the unusual emphasis on practical problem-solving in the local curriculum. By the mid-20th century, as the original rope transport system gradually fell into disuse, its physical presence in the landscape diminished. The emphasis on practical mechanics and problem-solving that began with Kincaid's informal training sessions evolved into a distinctive approach to education that characterized the local school well into the 20th century. But its influence on the community's approach to challenges remained evident in various forms. In the methodical preparation for winter weather that continued to exceed norms for the region, in the collaborative approach to infrastructure maintenance that distinguished the settlement from many of its neighbors, and most enduringly in the stories and values transmitted from one generation to the next. The Mountain Spirit Museum, established in 1992 to preserve and interpret the history of the Blue Ridge region, includes an extensive exhibit dedicated to Kincaid's rope system and its impact. The exhibit features a working-scale model of the system, reconstructed from Kincaid's detailed drawings, alongside artifacts recovered from the original installation and oral histories collected from descendants of the community. A video presentation recreates the Winter of Blue Death through dramatic reenactment, emphasizing how the community's embrace of Kincaid's innovation transformed a potential tragedy into a catalyst for positive change. Museum director Elizabeth Patterson, herself a descendant of families involved in the original events, summarizes the enduring significance of Kincaid's legacy. What began as one man's solution to a specific challenge became something much greater, a symbol of how communities can adapt and evolve when faced with unprecedented difficulties. The technical ingenuity was remarkable, certainly, but equally important was the social transformation that accompanied it. In shifting from initial rejection to eventual embrace of Kincaid's methods, the community demonstrated a capacity for growth and adaptation that remains relevant to our modern challenges. The lesson isn't about pulleys and ropes specifically, but about the value of preparation, the importance of remaining open to new approaches, and the power of cooperation in the face of adversity. As we reflect on this remarkable frontier tale, several themes emerge that speak directly to contemporary concerns. Kincaid's emphasis on thorough preparation and resilient design anticipated our modern understanding of adaptation to extreme conditions, an increasingly relevant concept in an era of climate uncertainty. His focus on efficiency and minimal environmental impact aligns with current priorities in sustainable development. And perhaps most significantly, the community's eventual embrace of his innovation demonstrates how crisis can catalyze positive change, transforming resistance into acceptance and ultimately into cultural integration. The mountain slopes where Abraham Kincaid once strung his innovative rope systems are now part of the George Washington National Forest. Hikers occasionally discover iron spikes embedded in ancient trees or rusted hardware half buried in the forest floor, physical reminders of a system that once transported life-saving supplies through the frozen landscape. These artifacts, like the story itself, stand as testament to the ingenuity, foresight, and adaptability that characterized the best of America's frontier spirit. In 2019, the United States Forest Service installed an interpretive marker at a trailhead near Kincaid's original property. The marker includes a reproduction of one of his technical drawings alongside a brief summary of his innovation and its impact on the community during the Winter of Blue Death. Visitors pausing to read this marker before venturing into the forest are participating in the ongoing process of cultural memory, keeping alive the story of a man whose approach to the challenges of frontier life continues to offer valuable lessons more than a century and a half after his time. Perhaps that is the most fitting memorial to Abraham Kincaid, not a monument of stone or bronze, but the living legacy of an idea that continues to evolve and find new applications. In the words of his final journal entry, what was once seen as excessive complexity has indeed been recognized as necessary thoroughness, a validation that extends far beyond the specific context of his original innovation to encompass a philosophy of preparation, adaptation, and resilience that remains essential in facing the uncertainties of our world.